Hi everyone, it's Rudolph here, and as promised I'm going to discuss catching carp on Artlure today. This is a very exciting way of catching carp and it's actually quite effective. I know of carp that's been caught from the Cape, in those dams and the rivers, in the Breda River and so on, all the way through in inland and here in Gauteng in these areas, and also all the way north to Limpopo. You can actually catch carp on this method of angling at most dams and rivers. You just have to know the basics, and if you get it right, you will have success. And it's actually quite a lot of fun to target them on lure, as they give you a decent pull every time. So it obviously determined, or it depends on how big the carp are. You know, smaller carp give you less of a fight. Some venues have smaller carp, some venues have bigger carp, but it's always a lot of fun targeting them. Okay, the most important thing to know regarding carp is that catching them on lure is not necessarily an easy fish to catch on lure. There's a lot of elements to it that you have to master, but once you get the gist, it gets a lot easier to catch them on lure. But yeah, just know from the start it's not necessarily easy. Um, One of the most important things to know regarding carp is that you want to be targeting them when you don't have a lot of wind around. Catching carp in stormy weather or in strong winds is extremely difficult, and having said that it's already difficult to catch them in the ideal conditions, it's even more difficult to catch them when there's a wind blowing around and so on. Another important factor that you have to take into consideration is that carp are extremely aware of their surroundings. So if you come in and make a lot of racket and noise, then you're just going to spook the fish and you won't be able to get close to them. And you have to be able to get relatively close to them to catch them. You can catch them on sight, and you can catch them bobber bashing, as they call it. It just determines from venue to venue, day to day, how they are feeding on that day. But yeah, very important that you come in as stealth as possible so that you don't spook that feeding fish, because a carp will hear your racket or the noise you make from far away, and they can also spot you quite easily as they have a very good eyesight. So you need to come in as stealth as possible. Another thing that plays a role here is that you don't want to be wearing too bright colors, shirts and so on. You want to use more camouflage clothes that you're wearing, or something that looks like the sky. A light blue is also a good color to go for, but they can see you easier if you're wearing brighter clothes. So that also plays a role for them. So noise is a big no for them. You need to be silent as possible, and also what you're wearing, beware of going with bright colors and so on. Try to remain stealth and camouflaged, and that will also play a role in your success. Carp are extremely opportunistic. So in many other countries they don't necessarily take a lure that's passing them or even considering going for it. But here in South Africa we are extremely privileged that most of our dams and rivers carps will take even sometimes crankbaits and jerkbaits that pass them. But if you present something that looks like an insect, they will most of the time consider taking it. But this differs a lot from venue to venue. Some venues the carp don't want to play along when you're targeting them on lures, but the other venues they greedily go for the lure. So that's quite important to realize that. Another thing that you also have to realize is that you can target them effectively, often wading on banks. You don't necessarily have to fish from them, target them from a boat, but some venues like Barberspan, Bloemhof and the Vaal River, or a lot of farm dams, you can actually target them by just wading down a bank. Sometimes you need to be wading in the water. It just depends on how deep they are feeding. Are they feeding on the bank, on the edges of the bank in the shallow water, or are they feeding a little bit deeper in? But yeah, that's also the important part to realize. I know at Barberspan and Bloemhof and the Vaal River, they're normally quite easy to catch, actually very aggressive. Often when you find banks with a lot of carp tailing on the banks, they will be more aggressive as they will be competing for the food they are looking for. What you also have to realize is the way that carp feed. What they will be doing is they're actually sticking their heads most of the time, especially when they're tailing. They'll be sticking their heads into the mud or sand, and they'll be sucking in some mud and spitting it out, and then looking for any insects that was hiding in the mud, and if they see them they will suck them up. So that's how they are basically, you can say, be digging for their food. And that's also what creates the bubbles. When they blow out the mud particles, it releases air, and that creates the bubbles that you see gathering on the surface, and that allows us to target them on bubbles as well. But the ideal is always to target them on sight. If you can see them, it's normally easier to catch them, because you can see exactly what direction they are feeding, and you can present your lure in the pathway that they are feeding. So that is a good thing to always take into account. Okay. As mentioned before, carp are very opportunistic, so if they see anything that looks like food, that looks like a small insect or even a bait fish, they will a lot of times suck it in, and that's just how they feed. But it's very important that your presentation falls in front of them where they can actually see the food. So if you dip at the tail, it's not necessarily going to turn around and grab your lure. Most of the time it will actually just spook and swim away. So you have to make sure that you drop that lure in front of the feeding carp where he can see it. And if you drop it too far away, it will often also not see the lure and it will not react to it. But sometimes you just have to give it a little movement, and that will attract them and catch their attention, and then they will swim towards it and suck it in. So remember, you have to place that lure quite close to the carp, in his eyesight or in his vision where he can see, and then he will take the lure. But your margin of error when targeting carp is extremely small. You need to be around, let's say, 30 centimeters in a circle around where you can see. Time of the day also plays a major role. It is easier to catch them normally in early mornings. That's normally before the wind comes up, and that's when we will be looking for them. But also in the afternoons when it's nice and hot and the shadow water have warmed up because of the sun being high in the sky and it's the heat of the day, then they'll often also be feeding. It's just that the wind often bothers you that time of the day, so we normally like to target them before the wind comes up. But if the wind gives you a gap, you can also catch them in the afternoon. It's very difficult to catch them normally late afternoon because of the angle of the sun, which creates a glare on the water, and if you can't see through the glare, then it's difficult to see the carp physically if you're targeting them on sight, and it's often also difficult to see the bubbles when there's a lot of glare on the water. So the position of the sun also plays an important part. So yeah, check where the sun is. You want as little as possible glare on the water, and also here it makes a huge difference. It's crucial that you have a good polarized sunglasses so that it can block out as much of that glare and allow you to see through the water and also see the bubbles that's gathering on the surface. So that also plays a major role. And then seasons also play a role. It's easier to catch carp in the summer times and spring times than in the winter. We have been able to catch them in the winter. Some days they will allow you to target them on lure in the winter as well, but it's more difficult in general as they stick to the deep water during that time. But if a dam's water temperature stays high enough in the shallows and it's warm enough in the shallows, then sometimes they'll continue feeding in the shallows throughout winter. It just depends on the venue. So other times in the winter you get them feeding on the surface as there is a scum line forming. That's especially at our closer venues here to Gauteng. We find them feeding on the surface on the scum line, and during those times it's difficult to catch them on lure, and you'll be targeting on fly rather than on lure during those times. When it comes to spawning time, it's normally a good time to target carp as you have bigger carp swimming in the shallows, a lot of those fat ladies that you actually want to be catching. But it depends, are they busy spawning or are they busy feeding? Normally with a spawn you'll have a portion of the carp that's busy spawning and the other portion are actually feeding on the eggs of the ones that already spawned. So they're actually controlling their numbers by themselves. The ones that are feeding on those eggs are normally quite aggressive, and if you approach them and you target them, you can catch them effectively, and that's often the times of the year that you will catch your PBs because they have all those extra weight of all the eggs that they are carrying. Okay, regarding fishing with the wind and so on, and the reason we don't like wind is often the wind will make a little bit of interruption on the surface. It creates a little bit of a ruffle, and that makes it difficult to see through the water and physically see the carp feeding or even see the bubbles. So that's the reason we don't like fishing in the wind. Also, the wind creates waves that splash against your boat, and that also creates interruption that can spook the carp as you approach it. They will hear a splash and then they will swim away. So, therefore, we prefer to fish when there's no wind blowing, but sometimes a light wind pushing can be used to your advantage. What we will do normally in that situation when fishing from the boat is that we'll ride upwind, far upwind, and then we'll actually just use the wind to our advantage and drift down with the wind, and that way we can actually drift down a bank and work even more stealth than when driving with the trolling motor. So that helps us to actually target them more effectively. Also, as you are working with the wind behind you and drifting down a bank, the idea would also be for you that the sun is behind you, so that you don't have a glare that you're staring into the whole time. So the ideal situation for us as Artlure anglers is with a light wind pushing us down or drifting us down a bank, and the sun behind us allowing us to see as far as possible, and that would enable you to catch them a little bit easier. Sometimes it's the small things that makes the biggest difference in your results.